So this week's question and answer session, few questions from this week, some pretty good ones. So let's kick it off. A general question about the progressive era. How are the progressives able to do things for their constituents, make their lives better, while simultaneously discriminating against Asians and blacks? Did they not recognize the hypocrisy? The short answer to this is generally no. The more complex answer to this is there a couple of other things going on with the progressive era. Um, First, during the Wilson presidency in particular, this is a map of the U.S. Senate during the Wilson years. The blue states had two Democratic senators. The red states had two Republican senators. The purple states had one senator of each party. And I think the thing to sort of note from this map is the Democrats at this point tended to be very, very strong in the South. Um, Southern senators were there were two sort of core beliefs. The first is that they were segregationist on the basis of race, and the second is that as representatives of the poorest part of the country at the time, they wanted federal reform efforts. And so, to a certain extent, politically, if you're going to advance a progressive agenda in the 19 teens, you have to do so on the backs of segregationist senators. And FDR will do the same thing in the 1930s. We'll get to that next week. And so one of the results of this is that reform programs tend to, at the very least, accommodate Jim Crow, and in Wilson's case, celebrate. Two other factors here. The first is Wilson's, intrinsic racism. The second is that in terms of understanding progressivism, there are multiple strands of progressivism. One is a kind of economic reform populist, but another is a sort of social reform. Think about the temperance movement, and there's a sense among progressives that part of their job is to create a more assimilated society, organized around principles of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and so racism is, not all progressives are racist, certainly, but there is a kind of strand of progressivism that is very comfortable with a racist worldview, and I think that's personified by Wilson. So certainly progressivism in the 19 teens is not an anti-racist philosophy. Second question, why were American troops in Russia during the revolution if the U.S. never joined the League of Nations? This is an extremely good question. And basically the answer is this is an outgrowth of World War I. So in 1918, the Russians pull out of the World War I. Remember, they were an ally of the Britain, France, and Italy. And when the U.S. entered the war, they were an ally of the United States as well. And they negotiated a treaty called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which turns over all of this area here in orange to the Germans, and the Germans almost wind up winning the war as a result of this, because they're able to transfer their troops from the Eastern Front over to the West. And the Americans come in and prevent it. The British and the French are very worried about the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. They're also worried about the strategic situation here in Eastern Europe, and the fact that they have a lot of war materiel that was on the ground in Russia to keep the Russians in the war. And so in 1918, the Allies, including the United States, and again, this is as World War I is still going on, authorized an intervention in Russia, ostensibly for the purpose of maintaining. Of reacquiring the British and French war material that they had given to the Russians to wage war. Their argument was, look, Russia isn't in the war anymore. Why should they get the material? But in fact, these interventions and the key American interventions were in Murmansk here in northern Russia, and in Siberia here in far eastern Russia. The purpose of the intervention seemed to be to bolster the cause of the whites, the non-communist forces in the Russian Civil War. So this is an intervention which initially was justified on grounds that it advanced the war effort, and then the troops kind of stayed in there by inertia because the British, the Americans, and the French were all very concerned about a communist triumph in the Russian Civil War. But there was no congressional authorization, obviously, for this intervention. Next question, how was the ERA law never been put into the Constitution when people have fought for it so many times? It's assumed that everyone is equal in the Constitution, so is the amendment pointless? So, yeah, this is an interesting question. So this is the current map of the ERA as of, March 2021. Now there's a problem here, which is that when the ERA was proposed to Congress, it had a 7-year deadline. So if it wasn't ratified in 7 years, needed 3/4 of the states, that it wasn't going to get ratified at all. And so what you see is that these gray states never ratify. There are 3 states that have ratified in the past 12 months: Nevada, Illinois, and Virginia, which ostensibly puts the ERA over the 3/4 that are needed. But of course, there are 2 problems. The first is that, the authorizing resolution said the ERA was supposed to be ratified by 1979, or else it wasn't ratified. And secondly, there were 5 states that initially ratified: Idaho, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kentucky, and Tennessee, that subsequently rescinded their ratification. So if these states can do a late add, Nevada, Illinois, and Virginia, in theory, they should be able to do a late subtract. So in any case, there aren't 3/4. It's not going to be added to the Constitution anytime soon as an amendment. This is getting a little bit ahead of the game in terms of where we are in the course, but the primary justifications for the ERA are in some ways less pressing now than they were, certainly in Alice Paul's time in the 1920s, or even in the 1970s, because there's been significant advancement in terms of federal legislation to protect against gender-based discrimination, and also court interpretations, aligning a lot of gender-based discrimination as violation of the 14th Amendment or the Equal Protection, particularly the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So, if the ERA were part of the Constitution, would these underlying things be different? Maybe, but it's harder to say. So to a certain extent, I think by now, it's more of a symbolic gesture than a gesture that would actually have, an effect on policy or on the courts. And then the last question on the topic of Debs: was it legal for him to run for president while in prison, and is this still allowed to this day? The answer to this question is yes and yes. It was legal for Debs to run for election from prison. He was in federal penitentiary in Atlanta. This was one of the kind of cheeky campaign buttons that the socialists ran in 1920. And while it's true Debs' support dropped between 1912 and 1920, he still got around 3% of the vote in the 1920 election. So there was a core socialist vote, and you can see it on this map. So the bigger the circle, the heavier the socialist vote in these areas. And so basically you see urban areas in Northern California, Seattle, Portland, Denver, so Western cities. Socialism was always very strong in the upper Midwest. Milwaukee had elected a socialist mayor, Chicago, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Detroit, Cleveland, and then of course New York City, where there was a kind of vibrant socialist community through the 1940s. So yeah, Debs does run. He's a credible candidate. In 1920, this is the last time the socialists do, get at least some chunk of a vote in a national campaign. And absolutely, this remains, it's legal to do it now. And the highest profile recent example came in 2012, when a resident of a Texas federal penitentiary, serving, I think it was like a 17-year sentence, named Keith Judd, files in a number of states in the Democratic primary against President Obama, and incredibly gets 40% of the vote in the West Virginia primary. The reason for this had nothing to do with Judd. It's not like West Virginians are excited about this federal prisoner. It was that West Virginia didn't like Obama at all, and Judd was the only candidate on the ballot. So yeah, you can, in theory, have a felon, but of course it makes it difficult to run an active campaign. So those are the questions for this week. Hope everyone is staying safe, and I will talk to you soon.